Even people who know nothing about business or finance will know the name Warren Buffett. As the story goes, he purchased his first shares over 83 years ago, and since then has had what many consider to be the greatest investing career of all time. His prudent approach to picking, and sometimes creating, winning businesses has made him one of the richest men in the world. And in the process, he has minted over more than a dozen other billionaires who followed in his wake. Perhaps most interestingly though, he has done all of this while remaining largely popular with the general public. Today, even after a long enough lifetime to collect potential scandals, he is one of the few global billionaires to enjoy a positive net approval rating, which, when you think about it, doesn't make that much sense. If you actually look into details of his business's extended history, you will find that he has stripped companies for parts, helped to kick off the private equity boom, lobbied for favourable regulations at the expense of consumers, been embroiled in antitrust lawsuits, union fights, and has had more than his fair share of double standards. Like the time when he called derivatives financial weapons of mass destruction, right before his company sold billions of dollars worth of those same derivatives. Or made a big deal about how financially conservative he was driving a second-hand car right before purchasing a fleet of private jets. During the global financial crisis, he owned businesses which allegedly gave out predatory loans to bad borrowers, while also owning a significant stake in the company that was supposed to be overseeing the same market. After that whole system imploded, he then swooped in and made billions of dollars through favourable deals with names like Bank of America and Goldman Sachs. This is not to mention that, literally, his entire business model is just moving money around to make rich people even richer. We should hate this guy, right? And yet, we don't. But why? Well, some point to his folksy, down-to-earth image. He drives a beat-up car, eats McDonald's, and lives in an old house just like you. How much of this is real and how much of this is played up for the media is something we will need to get to. But there is another theory. Buffett has been investing in US companies for 1/3 of the existence of the USA itself. He has been compounding returns through 15 presidents, 13 major recessions, and the most intense period of global wealth creation in recorded history. During that time, and up until his planned retirement in just a few months, his career has shaped American history as much as it's been shaped by American history. Maybe he really is as humble and sagely as the investor events would have you believe. Maybe time heals all wounds, or maybe it just hasn't mattered.
Warren Buffett shocked tens of thousands of people, divulging his plans to retire as CEO of Berkshire Hathaway at the end of the year.
The time has arrived. Greg should become the chief executive officer.
Warren Buffett is the only person who, from scratch, built a company that is in the top 10 of the Fortune 500.
One of the lessons of the 2008 was the fact that every company in the United States was a domino, and those dominoes were placed right next to each other.
In 1942, at the age of 11 or 12, Warren Buffett made his first formal investment. He purchased 3 shares in the gas and utility company Cities Services. The exact details of this first trade are a bit murky. Some historical publications claim that he also purchased 3 additional shares for his sister, but in a 2018 letter to shareholders, the man himself claimed that he only purchased 3 shares, which were for him and him alone. Now, regardless of cutting his poor old sister out, there were 3 interesting details about this very first trade. The first is something of a historical side note, but the company he invested in, Cities Services, is still technically around today, although not under the same name. The business was merged with another company in the 1980s before being acquired by 7-Eleven's holding company, before being sold again to the Venezuelan State Oil Company in 1986. That means, today, this American oil and gas company, now known simply as Citigo, is owned by a government openly hostile to the country it is operating in.
The committee to humiliate and shame America?
Yes, it is Hugo Chavez's passion project.
Now, this little detail didn't matter for Buffett because the second point about this investment is that he didn't hold on to it for very long. There are 2 reasons why his first share purchase gets so much attention in the business history books. The first is that Buffett uses it as an example of his missed opportunities. He reportedly sold the shares for a small $6 profit, but had he held onto them, he would have sold them for over $600,000, which, even when adjusted for inflation, is a clear and practical example of long-term investing doing its thing. The second reason this gets talked about so much, if you were being a little bit more cynical, is that letting everybody know about how you were trading stocks before learning to shave is a great way to build a personal brand as someone who was just destined to become an investing genius. It sounds silly, but little quirks like these, and stories about how he invested in pinball machines in college, have all cultivated a reputation worth billions of dollars. But again, more on that later. The third detail of this share purchase, which is important to know, is that he made it through his father, who at the time was working as a stockbroker. Back in those days, share purchases were obviously not handled by tech platforms like they are today. Would-be investors would work directly with an actual middleman who would research the markets for them, make recommendations, and execute trades on their behalf for a commission. It was a respectable job, but not necessarily comparable to the stockbrokers of the 1980s making millions of dollars. It was more akin to a mortgage broker today. Usually they were educated people with skills in their particular field, but still mostly middle class. This was especially true during the years when Buffett was growing up, the Great Depression and the Second World War. Not exactly boom years for people working in the stock market. But the family did have many good fortunes on their side. The Buffetts may not have been exceptionally well off, but they were still a prominent family. Shortly after processing young Warren's first stock trade, his father gave up stockbroking when he was elected to Congress, where he would go on to serve 4 terms in total. Howard Buffett actually went against the popular political grain on a lot of big issues at the time. He spoke strongly in favor of maintaining a strict gold standard and warned against international overreach by America during the Second World War and even in the decades after it. These isolationist ideals were not necessarily shared by Warren in his own careers, but he did certainly inherit a slow, considered approach to dealing with the hot trends of the day. It is, however, worth recognizing that Buffett was not exactly starting from nothing. Even back then, having a daddy in Congress was a privileged position, even if they weren't all mysteriously multi-millionaires like they are today. But anyway, young Warren had another stroke of fortune early in his life as well. Ironically, another investor essential, and that was simply timing. Buffett's father was just slightly too old to be drafted into the Second World War, and Warren himself slightly too young. This was a turn of good luck that was not common for a lot of families at the time who would have had at least one generation going overseas to fight. Now, to be fair, Buffett has acknowledged his luck of being born in the right place at the right time.
The luckiest day in my life was the day I was born. Because I was born in the United States.
Being born in the 1930s, at the onset of the Great Depression, was also a blessing in disguise. His childhood was still comfortable, but he wasn't yet competing for jobs with everybody else left behind by the crash. He would effectively sit out that period of economic history and start his career in the 1950s, right before the most intense period of prosperity growth in American history. As far as timing goes, he literally bought the dip with his own birth. Now, the context of his early life is important, because when biographers and bootstrap enthusiasts talk about his early investing exploits and the childhood side hustles that amassed him $100,000 before he left college, they often leave out that he was clearly born into a privileged family at a privileged time. He got into good universities, despite, by his own admission, not being a particularly passionate student. And he had access to people that most aspiring business owners just didn't.
I didn't want to go to college, but my dad wanted me to go to college, and we didn't have SATs then, but he practically would have done the SATs for me. So he, in the truth, I always wanted to please my dad. I mean, he was a hero to me and still is.
Now, the big difference is he actually does acknowledge this luck, unlike a lot of other billionaires who try to talk up their self-made credentials. Warren has spoken frequently and passionately about just how fortunate he was to have his opportunities and to be born during a period of history where reading financial documents was a skill that society actually valued. To that end, his first real job out of college was at his dad's stockbroking firm as an investment salesman. This is exactly what it sounds like. Back in the 1950s, people didn't have sketchy finfluencers or crypto bros telling them about the next hot investment. Even looking up company financials or price charts was extremely difficult for most people before the internet, so they relied on their stockbrokers for advice. Buffett's job was effectively a toned-down version of what you see in The Wolf of Wall Street. He would get on the phone, call clients, and try to get them to make trades, earning a processing commission every time they did. According to his own recount in the biography The Snowball, he hated this job because it was just high-pressure sales rather than genuine analysis. It did, however, bestow him with the skills to talk up a company to investors, whether he really believed in it or not, something that even he admits has paid dividends over his lifetime. It was at this time that Buffett made what he claims was his single best investment ever. He enrolled in a public speaking course taught by Dale Carnegie, best known as the author of How to Win Friends and Influence People. In several press interviews he has given throughout his lifetime, Buffett has made special efforts to point out that he displays this certificate in his office rather than his master's degree from Columbia. He would use his newfound public confidence to hold lectures about the stock market at a local college in Nebraska where, apparently, most of the students were double his age. The point is that for a man who wanted to make his whole career about technical analysis, he spent his first years in the real world honing his interpersonal skills. He eventually left his dad's firm to take a job with the one and only Benjamin Graham. Graham was one of Buffett's college professors, but he also ran a successful investment firm built on the ideas of what he called value investing. The simple idea was that Graham and his firm would try to figure out how much a company was really worth. They'd look at earnings, assets, and liabilities, but also brand appeal, ongoing contracts, intellectual property, market power, and even their long-term track record of predictable dividend payouts. Based on this, he would give a company an intrinsic value, and if that value was greater than the company's market capitalization, he would buy up the stock. It was kind of like doing a blind appraisal of a house based on bedrooms, bathrooms, and school districts. And if your educated guess of what the home was worth was more than what the sellers wanted for it, you would buy it up. This sounds easy in theory, but of course the real skill was in coming up with an accurate appraisal of a business's true worth. Any schmuck could look through some financial records and make a case for a company being worth twice its market capitalization. Likewise, someone overly cautious might think that the market is overpricing everything. At Graham's firm, Buffett learned to scour through business after business, finding something that the market was undervaluing, so his firm could swoop in and profit off the discount. Today, the same kind of operation would be next to impossible because algorithms constantly scour the market and instantaneously do the work that Buffett and his peers were doing by hand. But back then, this analytical and measured approach to investing was really quite revolutionary. It was a good business where Buffett learned a lot about actually managing investor money. On top of that, he was paid very well. By 1956, after just 2 years with the firm, he had saved up over $170,000. That's equivalent to $2.1 million today, and all at the age of just 26. But just as Buffett's career was really taking off, his mentor, Benjamin Graham, shut his whole investment firm down so he could retire. After just 6 years working for his father and his college professor, Buffett now had to go out on his own to prove his worth against the market. His first move was to return back to his childhood home of Omaha, Nebraska. He figured that with the money he had saved, he could live much longer out there than in an expensive city like New York or DC. On top of that, his style of investing worked better the farther away he was from the noise of Wall Street. Coming up with an objective and unbiased valuation for a business is a lot easier when you aren't chattering with thousands of other market speculators day in and day out in the big financial hubs. Using Benjamin Graham's old firm as a template, he started a series of investment partnerships, raising money from family members and contacts he had made in his short but successful gig at his father's firm. Over the next 5 years, he would make a lot of money using a strategy called cigar butting. Buffett would look for companies that had more assets than their liabilities and market capitalization combined. He would then take a large stake in those companies and use his influence to encourage them to liquidate their assets and cut down on expenses to get the business working again. For example, One of the biggest early successes was the Sanborn Map Company. The company itself had accumulated assets in its own share portfolio, which was worth around $8 million. But the business also had debts of $1 million. But overall, the company was trading at a market cap of just $5 million. So Buffett correctly surmised that he could buy the business, pay off its debts, and get $7 million worth of shares in other companies for just $4.5 million. Put another way, the market was effectively valuing the operation part of the business that actually produced maps at a negative $2 million. Now, he never actually purchased the entire company because he didn't need to. By the time he had amassed a large enough stake in the business, company management saw what he was up to and made a deal. They would give Buffett a portion of the company's financial assets in exchange for Buffett's shares in the company itself. This little deal netted him more than a 50% return in just 2 years, and it didn't involve any major hostilities. Other deals were not quite so pleasant. Buffett tried to do effectively the same thing on a company called Dempster Mill, but turning that company around involved a lengthy process of liquidating assets and cutting costs. It was profitable, but it made Buffett deeply unpopular amongst workers who lost their jobs just so he could take advantage of a market discrepancy. But this was why it was called cigar butting. The companies that he was targeting were essentially finished. But if he could get one last puff out of them without having to actually spend any more money, they were, in theory, still a good investment. Today, it's essentially impossible to find these kinds of businesses, and Buffett's reputation is worth more than any value he could suck out of the corpse of a failing company. And even if you were a completely heartless businessman with a time machine back to the 1960s, these deals still carried a lot of risk. In 1965, Buffett found this out firsthand when he made what he himself calls his worst investment ever, a small textile company called Berkshire Hathaway. So it's time to learn how history works, to see how Buffett took this from the worst investment ever to one of the most valuable companies of all time. Today's episode is sponsored by Brilliant. Brilliant is a powerful learning platform built around the idea that the best way to understand something is to do it. With thousands of interactive lessons in maths, science, and computer science, it helps you build real intuition through problem solving, not passive watching. One course that really stood out for me is scientific thinking. It digs into how we form models of the world, test ideas, and challenge assumptions. Basically, the same tools historians and scientists use to make sense of the past. It's not a history course, but it sharpens the kind of thinking that history actually depends on. I've been working through it myself, and it's made me look at historical analysis differently. You start with the basic logic puzzles and end up evaluating evidence, spotting bias, and asking smarter questions. It's surprisingly relevant, and honestly, pretty addicting. And the best part? You can do it on your own time. Whether you've got 5 minutes between errands or an hour to dig deep, Brilliant fits around your schedule. So if you're curious about how we learn from the past, or just want to level up your thinking, Brilliant is a great place to start. To learn for free on Brilliant, go to brilliant.org/howhistoryworks, scan the QR code on screen, or click on the link in the description. Brilliant's also given our viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited daily access to everything on Brilliant. Okay, here's a question for you. What is Berkshire Hathaway? Just like Lehman Brothers and a lot of the other financial firms we have delved into on the channel before, the answer is not as clear as people think. You might just say it's an investment firm, a hedge fund, an asset manager with a private equity wing, or maybe even a glorified insurance company. If you are a real history buff, or you were paying attention before the ad break, you might even say that it was a textile manufacturer. Well, over the company's history, it was simultaneously all of these things, and none of them at the same time. I know I am being deliberately ambiguous here, but truly understanding how Berkshire changed over its nearly 200-year history reveals a lot about the man who was at the helm for 55 years of that time. It can also help to clear up some pretty logical questions like, if Warren Buffett really was the greatest investor of all time, why doesn't everybody just try to copy this business model? Well, Berkshire itself was founded almost 100 years before Buffett was born as the Valley Falls Company of Rhode Island. The business would buy cotton from the southern states and turn it into textiles that could be exported across the country and the rest of the world. The early company merged with 5 other mills to stay alive during the Great Depression. These merged businesses collectively became Berkshire Fine Spinning Associates. At the same time, Horatio Hathaway had started a competing mill in the same region of America. Just to give you a sense of how old these businesses are, Mr. Hathaway's original business pitch was that textile manufacturing would offer a better return to investors than the whaling industry. These businesses eventually faced increasing pressure, not from overseas, but from within the United States. The South slowly developed their own mills, and back then, workers down there were paid much less than they were up north, even in the early 20th century. We don't have time to get into why, but you can probably make an educated guess. Anyway, the two companies were struggling, so in 1955, they joined in a desperate attempt to stay relevant. In the book, The Complete Financial History of Berkshire Hathaway, Adam Mead put their business situation like this. Berkshire Hathaway at this time was a melting snowball trying to maintain its size by furiously appending other wet, melting snow. Instead of recognizing the heat and seeking shelter or changing course, the managers of the 1955 Berkshire Hathaway conglomerate stayed on the same path, hoping for a different result. This book and all of the others that I mentioned in this video will be linked down below like always. Anyway, despite the merger just 7 years later, Berkshire Hathaway was struggling so much that it had become a cigar butt, which caught the attention of Warren Buffett. His early plan was to repeat what he had already done with several businesses before, take control of the company, sell down its considerable assets, and refine its bloated business operations for a quick turnaround and a nice little payday. He started buying up shares in the business and quickly caught the attention of then CEO Seabury Stanton, who knew what Buffett was up to. In 1964, Berkshire Company leadership went to make a deal with Buffett. They would sell their assets to buy back his shares at $11.50 each. That's an almost 50% premium from his initial purchase. Though what should have been another neat little deal went sour when the paperwork for the sale came back with a purchase price of just $11.35 per share. That's 15 cents less than the company's management had agreed to in their handshake deal. Out of principle or pride, Buffett walked away from the deal and continued to buy up a controlling interest in the company before ousting the management who had insulted him and then replacing them with his own directors. It was some major big Richard energy. But the problem was, Buffett was now stuck with a company that he didn't really know how to run, in a failing industry being eaten alive by global competition. He sunk a lot of money into getting the business working again, but it didn't really achieve much apart from throwing good money after bad, so he pivoted. He dissolved all of the separate investment partnerships he had built up before and either paid out his early investors or gave them stock in his new textile business. He figured that Berkshire, as a public company, was effectively just an investment vehicle. It was a machine that turned investor money into even more money. It's just that in the 1960s, that machine was trying to achieve this goal by making textiles. So instead of throwing it out altogether, Warren just got under the hood and changed some of the components. Buffett and his early investors never actually bought all of the shares in Berkshire. So there are still people around today who bought some stock in a failing textile mill after the war and accidentally saw it turn into one of the most successful investment vehicles ever. Not that I think they would complain. By 1970, Buffett had appointed himself CEO of Berkshire and set about transforming it entirely. Sitting at the helm of a company he had purchased effectively by accident, he took the advice of a business partner who had started working with him along the way. Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett met during the late 1950s, and the pair started working together on various investment partnerships. But now that a decade's worth of work had been sunk into this single business, Munger made a suggestion. How about instead of buying bad businesses at a great price, they should instead buy great businesses at a fair price? It was a nice sentiment that went on to serve them well, but truthfully, the days of flipping undervalued businesses were coming to an end anyway. More competition had moved into the market, so made those already rare cigar butt opportunities even harder to come by. Also, or again, if you wanted to be cynical, new capital gains laws introduced in 1969 meant that buying and holding became more tax efficient than buying and selling for incremental profits. Whatever the real motivation was, Berkshire's first step in building its portfolio of great businesses was to get into insurance. Today, the company is one of the largest insurance businesses in the world. On top of its own white label operations, it also owns industry giants like Geico. But there is a very good reason for this. Insurance companies gave the business an enormous amount of cash through something called a float. Basically, when you go to get insurance, you pay your premiums up front for coverage that normally lasts for the next year. And when millions of people are paying their premiums at the beginning of the year, that can add up to billions of dollars. You might think how insurers make their money is by writing contracts in such a way that less money will be paid out for claims that they receive in premiums. Now, sometimes this happens if the actuaries do a good job of accurately assessing risk. But the real opportunity is actually the simple fact that, in the meantime, the insurance company gets to hold onto this bag of cash. To simplify, imagine you are an insurance company who insures 10,000 people against the risk of flipping a tail in a coin toss. The premium you charge them for this insurance is $1, and the payout if they flip a tails is $2. Once everybody is lined up to have their turn flipping the coin, you should, statistically at least, break even on the whole endeavor. But in the meantime, you could have been collecting interest on the pot. By targeting the insurance industry, Buffett was essentially playing the same game, just on a much larger scale. Insurance companies could be purchased for a fraction of the money they actually held in their floats. This is kind of like how banks hold onto money that isn't really theirs. JP Morgan Chase has $3.7 trillion in assets under management, but the company itself is only worth $830 billion. The difference between banks and insurance companies is that clients can take their money out of banks at any time. With insurance, clients only get paid if some particular event happens. And those events are much less likely to happen all at once. In 1967, just 2 years after taking control of Berkshire Hathaway, Buffett purchased National Indemnity Company for $8.6 million in total. But that gave him access to over $19 million in the company's float, which he could then invest. This was a particularly smart move because it created a feedback loop. If Buffett made good investments, it actually didn't matter if the insurers lost a bit of money on premiums versus claims because the investment returns would cover the difference, and then some. In a sense, the clients of the insurance company were effectively just giving Buffett and Berkshire a very low interest rate loan. But if Buffett made exceptionally strong returns, the insurers could lower their premiums even further. Yes, they would statistically lose more money on the insurance side, but it would attract more new clients, giving Buffett even more cash to invest. All of this profit also gave Berkshire the money to go and buy even more insurance companies. So then, if all of this was working so well, why does Buffett insist that Berkshire was his worst investment ever? Well, this has more to do with the things he could have invested in instead. If he had first built an insurance investment vehicle from the ground up, instead of, just buying and remodeling some random textile mill, he would have made a few $1 million extra right at the very beginning of his career. If he had used that money to buy an extra insurance company instead, he calculated that he would be about $200 billion further ahead today. But he made do with what he had. For the first few decades under Buffett's stewardship, Berkshire was effectively just an insurance conglomerate that happened to invest their float really well. Even today, insurance is still one of the central pillars of the business. But getting your hands on other people's money is the easy part. Turning that into predictable and consistent returns was a bit more of an art form. Buffett was now flush with plenty of cash. He started looking for good businesses that he could get control over and own forever. Often the best businesses were not listed on public stock markets, so he had to delve into everybody's favorite financial buzzwords: private equity. It's true, some of Buffett's best investments were private equity deals, like his purchase of the Nebraska Furniture Mart, which Berkshire still owns to this day. Now, here's the thing. Most people who know about private equity hate private equity, and for good reasons. But, and if you can hold the tomatoes for a second, I would argue that you don't hate what private equity is, you hate what it has become. Private equity is really just the purchase of shares, also known as equity, in any business that is not listed on public markets. So if you buy a stake in a local cafe, you are technically a private equity investor. The problem is that major investment firms figured out that they could pull a lot of financial shenanigans with private companies, which is how we ended up with the buyout funds of today. Now, we have made a lot of videos about exactly how these firms work or don't work, so we aren't going to get into the details here, but Berkshire was different. Instead of saddling companies with lots of debt and cutting everything they could, Buffett and Munger tried to find good businesses that they could actually give some of their huge cash reserves to for them to reinvest and expand their operations. The wider the portfolio of these businesses got, the more secure they became. If one business hit hard times or had an expansion opportunity, Berkshire could move money from the other businesses into the portfolio or the insurance float to give them the capital needed without needing to take on debt. For a long time, this approach was one of Berkshire's most attractive aspects to investors. Anybody could buy shares in Berkshire off regional stock exchanges, and then later the New York Stock Exchange. But not everybody could buy entire private businesses, and even fewer could still do it successfully. Ironically, at around about this time, Berkshire Hathaway, which was originally listed on those markets as a textile mill, closed down its last textile factory and became purely an investment vehicle. Berkshire gave regular investors indirect access to an asset class that they wouldn't be able to afford or manage themselves. But as the company started compounding more and more money, Buffett eventually ran out of good small businesses to buy, and simultaneously started having enough cash to make major public acquisitions. Starting in the 1970s, Berkshire bought up large stakes in companies like American Express, The Washington Post, and Coca-Cola. Berkshire, and by extension Warren Buffett, didn't get a controlling interest in these companies, but they didn't really need to. Coca-Cola has become perhaps the company's most famous long-term investment, yet Berkshire owns less than 10% of the business. This means that, technically, Buffett is a minority shareholder like any other, and he can't single-handedly force the company to do anything he wants, like he could with his wholly owned private businesses. However, he still does represent the largest single voice on shareholder votes, so company leadership does want to keep him happy. But more importantly than that, these companies value his opinion. Berkshire may be the company that owns shares in Coca-Cola, but some would argue that Coca-Cola got an asset just as valuable because now they have the ability to pick up the phone and directly ask Warren Buffett for advice. This intangible value is no accident, and it's something that the business takes just as seriously as any of the other assets in its growing portfolio. I hate to be the one to break this to you, but the reason you have seen so many clips about Warren Buffett's humble lifestyle is because he wants you to see them. Talking about his average suburban home and second-hand car makes him look like a prudent manager who doesn't waste money on frivolous displays of wealth. When he holds an interview in a run-down diner, it's not because clearing out an old restaurant was the easiest way to meet. It's so he can talk about how he prefers it there to some other fancier establishment. Of course, it's not just Buffett that does this. Working class people love pretending that they are richer than they are, and billionaires love pretending they are poorer than they are. Maybe there is some kind of psychological angle to look into there. But anyway, the point is that Bezos, Zuckerberg, Gates, Jack Ma, and even Sam Bankman-Fried have all done exactly the same kind of press tours talking about their crappy old automobiles. Why? Well, because it works. In reality, Buffett and the rest of them all get driven around in big black SUVs with a large entourage, and honestly, that's perfectly fine. They are high-profile public figures that can easily justify security and support staff. Buffett also flies private jets just like all those other billionaires. In fact, he has probably done more than any other man to make private aviation as mainstream as it is today. One of his largest private acquisitions was the company NetJets, which allows mere multi-millionaires to buy timeshares in jets if they aren't rich enough to buy one all for themselves. So no, none of them are living the simple life that their carefully choreographed media appearances would have you believe. But if they can win some easy publicity points, why wouldn't they do it? Buffett has just been committing to the bit harder and longer than the rest of them, and it's paid off in more than just good PR. Buffett has built up a reputation as not only a shrewd investor, but also an honest operator. And that reputation has given him access to opportunities that nobody else would be considered for. Following the 2008 mortgage crisis, Buffett was approached to make major strategic investments into Goldman Sachs and Bank of America. Buffett's slow and steady low-debt investment approach meant that by the time of this downturn, he had plenty of money in the bank and wasn't sweating it like almost every other financial institution in the world. That cash was a vital lifeline for these banks to ensure that they had enough money to keep on operating if the downturn dragged on. But getting that money from Buffett gave them something else. It was a tick of approval from someone who had built a reputation on being slow and careful. If old man Buffett, who apparently won't even spend money on a new car, is spending money on your firm, it's a pretty good sign to everybody else that you are in a good position. It was because of this good PR that he got what most analysts considered a sweetheart deal that returned over 80% annualized returns over just the next 5 years with a large degree of security. Today, the net asset position of Berkshire Hathaway is around $670 billion, depending on the markets of the day you actually watch this video. But that company itself has a market capitalization of almost $1.1 trillion. Put another way, if you somehow managed to buy the entire company for its current market price, you would get a pool of assets with a sticker value worth just over half of what you paid for it. So then, why are profit-driven investors paying almost twice as much to buy assets through this company instead of just buying similar assets directly? This is especially confusing when you realize that they publicly share which companies they are invested in. So if you wanted to, you could just copy them. But really, there are 3 reasons why people still pay the Berkshire premium. The first is because there is some accounting trickery that does make their asset portfolio look a little bit skinnier than it actually is. The second reason is to get access to private market investments without having to deal with all of the nonsense of typical private equity firms. And the third is because people believe that Buffett is the best steward of their money. They are not just buying an overpriced bag of assets, they are also buying the man filling it up. Now, this could present a problem in 3 months' time when Buffett officially steps down. He has trained some very competent successors, but whether it's logical or not, Buffett's ability to win friends and influence people has also won deals and influenced markets. A lot of people buy stock in Berkshire just so they can attend the now infamous shareholder meetings just to hear Warren Buffett speak. The company may technically be the same without him, but it also won't be the same without him. There probably won't ever be another investor quite like Warren Buffett, partly because he was a talented operator who recognized his privileges, and partly because one of his biggest privileges was the historical time frame he operated in. Go and watch this video next to find out why inequality only gets worse over time, apart from those few years when Warren Buffett was just getting started. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how history works.